When disabled German prisoners of war arrived in American custody during the final years of World War II, many believed their fate was sealed, because in a collapsing Germany disability often meant neglect, abandonment, or being quietly pushed aside, and Nazi ideology had long equated physical weakness with worthlessness, teaching soldiers that injury stripped them of value, dignity, and protection. So men who had lost limbs, suffered paralysis, blindness, or severe wounds expected captivity to be cruel, isolating, or humiliating. These POWs had been shaped by a system where compassion was seen as weakness, and where wounded soldiers were frequently hidden from public view, leaving them convinced that the enemy would treat them even worse. Yet from the moment they entered American camps, their expectations began to unravel, because instead of mockery or punishment, they were met with structured medical evaluations, careful handling, and a level of attention that many had not received. Since before their injuries, American doctors and medics assessed wounds, fitted crutches or prosthetic supports where possible, treated infections, and prioritized pain management, speaking to the prisoners directly through interpreters and explaining procedures in a way that restored a sense of agency, something the men had not felt in years. Even basic logistics carried emotional weight, as guards ensured disabled POWs were assigned accessible bunks, assisted during meals without embarrassment, and exempted from labor they physically could not perform, enforcing rules that protected rather than exploited their condition. What shocked the prisoners most was not just medical care, but attitude, because American personnel addressed them calmly, referred to them by name or number without insults, and never treated disability as a moral failing, a stark contrast to the rigid, often brutal environment they had known in the Wehrmacht during the war's final desperate months. Some POWs later recalled being stunned when guards slowed their pace to walk beside them, carried equipment without comment, or intervened if others mocked or ignored them, small gestures that quietly reinforced the idea that injury did not erase humanity. Historians note that American POW policy followed the Geneva Convention, but the treatment of disabled prisoners often went beyond minimum requirements, influenced by medical ethics, military discipline, and a broader cultural emphasis on rehabilitation and care for wounded veterans, and for German POWs conditioned to believe mercy was propaganda or weakness. This consistency was deeply disorienting. Over time, many disabled prisoners began to recover not only physically, but psychologically, as fear gave way to disbelief, and disbelief slowly turned into cautious trust, with some men admitting that captivity was the first time since their injury that they felt seen as individuals rather than burdens. Letters dictated after the war describe moments of quiet realization, such as understanding that no one would strike them for moving too slowly, that asking for help would not invite punishment, and that survival no longer depended on hiding pain or pretending to be stronger than they were. For some, this experience forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the ideology they had been raised in, because the enemy they had been taught to fear demonstrated restraint, professionalism, and empathy, while their own system had often discarded them once they could no longer fight. Decades later, former POWs reflected that the most shocking aspect of American captivity was not generosity, but dignity, because they were allowed to exist as wounded men without shame, threat, or constant fear. And this memory stayed with them long after repatriation to a devastated post-war Germany, where resources were scarce and care for the disabled remained limited. In the broader history of World War II, these stories receive little attention, yet they reveal a powerful truth about how wars end, not only through surrender documents and victory parades, but through everyday decisions about how the defeated and the vulnerable are treated. And for disabled German POWs who expected cruelty or abandonment, the shock came from discovering that power could be exercised without humiliation, and that even in captivity, humanity could be preserved, quietly dismantling years of indoctrination and leaving behind a lesson that endured long after the war itself had ended.